So it's so good to be with you guys again. Are you aware of what's happened since the last time we met?
No, you better tell us.
Oh my. Well, our little gathering of the seven or eight of us last 2 months ago. I asked if you guys had recorded it. Turned out you did, and you sent me a copy of that. And I thought, well, what the heck? I'll just go ahead and post that on YouTube and see what happens. Well, I posted that 1 hour video that we did last time for the seven or eight of us, and now it has been viewed over 125,000 times around the world.
Oh, my God.
I'm not exaggerating.
How many
There's
again? 120.
125,000 views
That's
around
great.
the world, and that includes way more than 50 countries. I believe of the top 10 cities that are viewing it, YouTube statistics can share that information. Of the top 10 cities, only three of them are in the United States. The rest of them are in, London is one of them. There's three cities in Australia are finding this very interesting. A couple cities in South Africa. It's all over the place. Anyway, so I don't know what kind of pull you guys have there in your house in Tennessee, but it's working. So everybody is watching what we're doing, and I think there's an increased interest in the topic that we're discussing, which
Amen.
today is going to be, well, my overall topic, as you know, is the assembly and how we got worship wrong. We talked about that last time. We have actually 7 different videos in this series that you see on your screen there. We've jumped ahead to number 4, which is why they didn't preach sermons in church. All these, by the way, have been posted on YouTube, and people can see any one of these 7. To recap the key issues from what I've been saying is number one, in the New Testament, they did not, in fact, describe their meetings as worship, nor
Why don't
did
you
they
stop and
describe
talk?
their meetings as a service. Now, commonly we call our worship or our gatherings worship services,
There you go.
but they didn't call it worship and they didn't call it service, nor did they call it a worship service, of course. Now, their terminology was dramatically different than ours. That doesn't mean that ours is wrong and theirs is right, or that theirs is wrong and ours is right. It just means that the terminology is substantially different, which makes us wonder, of course, maybe we aren't looking at this right. Another conclusion that I came to that we talked about last time, in the first century, Christians viewed their meetings as horizontally focused gatherings and not as formal ceremonial events. Now, people like yourselves who are experiencing a gathering as in a house, this isn't going to sound very strange to you because automatically your house-based setting is going to be rather horizontally focused and just a gathering. And it's going to be rather unusual for us to view it as a formal ceremonial event. And third thing, we learned that the Bible's worship words, that is the Greek or Hebrew terms that are translated as worship, actually refer to temple activities such as ritual prostration and sacrificing, and these terms are not used to refer to Christian assembly activity. Now, this gets a little bit confusing if we continue to use the word worship to refer to what we are doing. This doesn't mean that worship is wrong at all. It just means that their terms are different than ours. And also, their definition of the word worship is also different than ours. Uh, so, what I'm saying here also is not that they did not sing praises to God in their assemblies. They certainly did. I'm not saying that in first century assemblies they did not pray to God. They certainly did. I'm also not saying that they didn't take the Lord's Supper. They certainly did. But they didn't call any of those activities as worship. Anyway, so let's continue on with what we're going to be talking about this week, which is why they didn't preach sermons in church. And let me explain that, because that may sound somewhat offensive as well, just to begin with. But this is actually stemming from the same issue of the worship terms. If you look up the word preach in the Bible, you're going to find, yes, it's there. It's there a lot, but it does not refer to what Christians did in their assemblies. If you look up the word sermon in the Bible, you're actually not even going to find it. It doesn't even exist there. So that's sort of where we're coming from. So it begs the question, well, what did they do as far as their formal speaking parts in their assemblies? And this is where my dissertation went focused mostly on the worship aspect, but on this part as well. So here's my point. Today's concept of the pastor or preacher has actually very little in common with the biblical concept of the persons who spoke in a Christian meeting. That's my point. Let me read it just again to make sure everybody understands. Today's concept of the pastor or preacher is different from the biblical concept of the person or persons who spoke in a Christian meeting in the first century. That is what I'm saying here. Today's concept of the sermon also has little in common with the biblical concept of the kind of speaking that was performed in a Christian assembly in the first century. I'm going to explain all this here. Today, I think we find that the sermon, as it is commonly referred to, is the primary edifying element in a typical assembly. And I could even refine that a little further. I think it's the primary edifying element in a Protestant meeting. Okay. But it is, we typically would, if we're going to assess everything we do in our assemblies and ask the question, from which one of these events do we get the most amount of edification, which is Paul's demand in 1 Corinthians 14. We talked about that last time. Paul demands that all things in the assembly be done for edification. I think we would all agree that the sermon is one of those primary elements where we get edification from. But the sermon today is also the most time-consuming element. Typically, in most church gatherings, in whatever denomination, there's going to be more time devoted to the sermon than to anything else. With the church where I was today, the sermon occupied about a good 30, 35 minutes of a 60-minute gathering. So it's the most time-consuming thing in that meeting. It's also typically in Protestant meetings, the main course on the menu today. Don't you? I think most of us would see that this is true. It's where the focus is. What's the sermon going to be about today? What did they preach about last week? What was last week's sermon? And we don't talk about anything else in that particular meeting as being the thing to remember about that meeting. It's also, I find, the sermon is the primary determinant of attendance today. Again, we're talking about today. We're not talking about the first century. Where I'm coming from here is for the last 45 years, I've been conducting citywide church attendance surveys in my town and gauging how many people are going to church. And I started doing this in 1982 or 81. And so I now can compare data from church attendance from what it was in all the churches in my town in 1982, let's say, compared to what it is now, and to see what's going up or what's going down. And as a general rule, not even as general, attendance is dropping dramatically. But when I look over the years to see places where church attendance spiked at a particular church, the most common reason for a church attendance spike or a church attendance drop will be the pastor and his pastoral performance in his preaching. If you get a new guy and he's not so hot, attendance is going to drop. If you get a new guy and he's really good, attendance is going to spike. And that's typically what this powerful role that the sermon has today. It's also, if you look at breaking down everything we're doing in our assemblies as far as what costs the most, well, let's think about what you're charging or what your typical pastor is being paid, and look how much time he is spending on his sermon, And how much are you spending on the rest of this thing you're doing on Sunday? I know when I was in full-time pastoral ministry that I used to add up the number of hours I was spending on every sermon every week. And on average, I would spend typically about 10 hours per week on the sermon. And so let's say I'm being paid for 40 hours a week. So 1/4 of my salary is going to what? That 30-minute thing that we do during the week. That's a chunk of dough, depending on how you're paying your pastor in whatever church it might be. Interesting, if you look up the word sermon in the Bible, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually not found. The surprising thing is that the sermon word is not even found in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, that famous speech by Jesus in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 that we all call the Sermon on the Mount. The word sermon is not found in the text there. It can be found in a subhead that was inserted by the editors of that particular Bible, but it's not actually found in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean that if you use the word sermon in reference to the guy speaking, that you're going to go to hell. Of course not. And it doesn't indicate that your church is therefore apostate because you use the word sermon. But the point here is, it's interesting to look at the terminology used in the first century in regard to this speaking thing and the terminology that we use today. And then we compare the two and see perhaps what's different. What are we missing today that was there in the first century? And that's where this particular message is coming from. Church assemblies in the New Testament. By the way, I almost can't see that top part. Can you see the top part of your screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. I got to move this thing. Got it. Church speakers in the New Testament. What I did is I looked up the names or the titles of the different kinds of people who spoke in a church gathering in the New Testament. And these are the different words that are being used in the New Testament to refer to the people who speak. Apostles is extremely common. The word, every time the word apostle appears, it's not necessarily used in the context of somebody who is speaking in a church gathering, but the term is used a lot, and certainly apostles were those who did speak in a church gathering. The most common word that is used in the New Testament in reference to those people who are speaking in an assembly is elders. It's found 31 different times. Not always is the word elder used in reference to their speaking function, but it's clear that elders had a speaking or teaching role in assemblies. Ministers, this word is used also frequently, 27 times, not always in reference to the speaking duties in the assembly, but it is sometimes. Prophets, surprisingly, the word prophets pops up 20 different times, and it is frequently used in reference to the people who are doing some speaking in the New Testament. The word teachers also appears a lot of times, and not just the word teacher, but if you look at the verb teach, that's used a lot in the New Testament in reference to the kind of speaking that is done in a Christian assembly. Overseers or bishops certainly had a role in congregational gatherings. They're only mentioned about 5 times. And the word pastor, interestingly enough, is used only once in the New Testament, and is probably being used in a different sense than we use it today. The Greek word there is poimen, which is also translated as shepherd. So a pastor is really a shepherd or one of the shepherds in a congregation, and part of their shepherding duties is to speak to the congregation and to offer some teaching that helps everybody. But if we now look at, instead of at church speakers, I've somehow lost my ability to advance my slides. There they go. The other kinds of Christian speakers that appear in the New Testament, but not in a congregational setting, are these 3 words. One is evangelist. That's used 3 times. The word preacher is used a couple of times in the New Testament. And the word priestly minister is used in a a sort of spiritualized, figurative way. Paul uses that in reference to himself a couple of times. These terms are used in reference to people who are doing the proclamation of the gospel outside of the Christian assembly. Now, the kinds of assembly speaking that takes place in the New Testament, in other words, what are the words that are used to refer to what they actually did when they gathered together? The most common words are these two words that are in yellow highlight on your screen. To exhort or to encourage, that's used frequently, and the word teach is also used the most frequently of all the rest of these terms in reference to speaking, the kinds of speaking that is done in an assembly. Prophecy is also used, praying or singing and praising, speaking, reporting. You see all rebuking, debating, reading, dialoguing, conversing, tongues, revelation, knowledge, blessing, amen, and instruction. All these words are also used specifically in reference to assembly speaking activity. In other words, the kinds of communication that is being used in the assembly. Now, frankly, I've usually when you look up a study of this matter in books and articles that are written on church meetings, they usually don't break it down to the kinds of speech being used. And I think that chart you see on your screen right now is somewhat unique and helpful in just looking at the various kinds of speech patterns or speech types that were used in assemblies. But the most common purpose, or actually the common purpose of assembly speaking in the New Testament is, number one, to build up or edify one another. 1 Corinthians 14:26 is the key verse that we discussed at some length last time. There in that verse, Paul comes to a big conclusion of this huge chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where he's talking about what you are supposed to be doing in your assemblies. And in verse 26, he says, let all things be done for edification, or to build up one another. Now, this is also mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. Strengthening is the idea also in Acts 14, verse 22, where Paul went back into the communities where he had established a church. He sets up elders in each church, and he commissions them to be strengthening the congregations. That is the point of when they get together. They need to be getting stronger each time they gather together. Encouragement is also frequently used, and that Hebrews 13 passage is a good one on that. But really, you can see how all three of these things, building up one another, strengthening one another, encouraging one another, are all sort of the same idea of leading people to be better people than what they were last week. And so the idea in the New Testament is you're doing this not just one time, but you're doing it all week, every week for the rest of your lives in order to get better. But now if we look at the concept of preaching in the New Testament to see how that word is used, and it's used 104 times in the New Testament, in the New American Standard Bible. It's usually used in a phrase like preach the gospel, which is 52 of those times. Preach the gospel is actually one Greek word in the New Testament, usually evangelizomai, a Greek term where it means to proclaim the good news. You've heard that before, but that's the context in which preach is used there. It's also found in the Greek word kerusso, which means to proclaim. And basically, this is one-way proclamation that is done with the goal of gaining converts. In other words, this is not assembly activity. This is outside the assembly activity, where Paul would, for example, go into the Jewish synagogue, where he knew he already had a gathering of Jews who were there for their weekly meeting at the synagogue, and they also had a time in the synagogue meeting when somebody could get up and talk. And Paul took advantage of this to proclaim the gospel to outsiders in an effort to gain converts. So wherever Paul went, whether he's preaching on Mars Hill at Athens or by a riverside or wherever he is, he's preaching the gospel to these outsiders in an effort to bring them inside so that they can then meet with the other Christians in their regular gatherings, which were done in an effort to build up one another. Gerhard Friedrich, who is a German scholar who wrote the article on K. Russo in, in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. He made this statement. It stuck out to me, so I wanted to share it with you. He says, kerusein, which is the Greek word for this, he says, it does not mean the delivery of a learned and edifying or hortatory discourse in well-chosen words and a pleasant voice. Rather, it is the declaration of an event. Its true sense is to proclaim, which is a little bit different than the way we see preaching in our context in Christian assemblies. Preaching in the New Testament is rather interesting when it's being used so much as a term to refer to what's going on outside the congregation. I ran across this article years ago, written in 1981 by Dr. Craig Evans. You may have heard that name before. Craig Evans has about 70 different books that he's published. It may be 80 by now. But he's a New Testament scholar, well known in the evangelical realm. And he wrote this article back toward the beginning of his career entitled Preacher and Preaching, Some Lexical Observations. In other words, he's taking a look at what this word actually means in the New Testament. And he comes to some interesting statements. He says all of the examples of kerusein refer either to gospel proclamation to the lost or impenitent, or to announcing something of a secular nature. It is never used in the sense of preaching to a local congregation. Now, I guess I'm using Craig Evans here just simply because he agrees with my observations as well, because I did the same thing he did. I did the same thing that Gerhard Friedrich did. I looked up every time this Greek word is found and tried to make some conclusions based on what we see there in the evidence in the New Testament. And Craig Evans is dead on correct here. It is never used in the sense of preaching to a local congregation. But if I had to summarize all the biblical evidence about these preaching terms and teaching terms and this Christian speech in an assembly, teaching and exhorting are the most common types of assembly speaking in the New Testament. And the common purpose for assembly speaking was clearly to edify or to strengthen the body of Christ in that room, wherever this speaking is taking place. Well, you might say, well, Wadsworth, what's the big problem with preaching? Do you think that we're all going to hell if we use the word preach or preacher? Well, no, I don't think that at all. But I think what we do need to do is let's take a fresh look at what's going on in the New Testament. And then let's sort of reassess what we're doing today to see if there might be some, what do you know? There might be some advice there in the New Testament that tells us what we should be doing in our gatherings. The problems, I think, of preaching is, number one, most listeners become passive spectators. After all, it's just one guy at the front, usually in an elevated pulpit above and beyond everybody else. And the rest of us sit in these pews, all looking forward directly at that person, and we become passive spectators in the entire process. Personal development, I think, is then thereby hindered. If it's only one person who's studying for a lesson, it's only one person who's doing some speaking and sharing what he's thinking that week, where's the personal development in everybody else? We're sort of counting on everybody growing and learning a lot from that one guy who's standing up and speaking at a lengthy period of time. A third problem, I think, of preaching is that an evangelistic emphasis, which is often there in a lot of more conservative evangelical churches, tends to thwart edification. What I mean there is, I know that in the church, what I was associated with 40 years ago would demand that I closed all my sermons with an invitation, where I would make an appeal to outsiders in the room to become Christians. Now, all that's fine and dandy, and once in a blue moon, it might actually happen. But if I am bringing my every message to a conclusion that's evangelistically oriented, I think we're starting to lose the edification emphasis in that message and lose it to the idea of evangelizing. But that is where the modern culture has often drifted, depending on, of course, the nature of the church culture in which you live. Also, one of the problems of preaching is that the preacher or pastor is thereby elevated. And not only physically, because he's usually at a higher level, a higher altitude than anybody else, but he's also elevated in our minds as he's the guy who's worth listening to today, and certainly nobody else. He's the one that has the answers of all things religious, and he becomes elevated. What happens to the rest of us? Well, I think by implication, we're all demoted. We're just a bunch of slugs sitting in the pews waiting for somebody to feed us and tell us what we don't know already. Um, I think these are problems that go along with the idea of preachers and preaching in the way we have done things today. Now, you guys may be having some questions. So let's hold on to those. We'll get those to the end. And I want to be openly dealing with all of your questions and even objections to what we're saying here today. So I think there are three things that biblically we lack by doing church the way we do it today, by having this such a focus on preachers and preaching of sermons. And the number one thing I think we're lacking is one anothering. Now, you may not have heard that term before. It comes from a Greek word that's used about 100 times in the New Testament called allelon, but it is translated as one another in the New Testament, or sometimes each other. We see a lot of these references in the New Testament. For example, in Romans 15, verse 14, Paul says, I'm satisfied about you, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another.
That's good.
I mean, in a typical church, is this true today? That everybody is full of goodness and filled with all knowledge and able to instruct? And if they are able to instruct, why aren't we allowing them to do that? I just toss that up for something to think about. First Thessalonians 5:11, Paul says at the end of this epistle to the Christians at Thessalonica, he says, therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. So Paul even knew that they're already involved in encouraging one another and building one another up, probably in their speaking duties happening during their assemblies, and that they just needed to keep on doing what they're doing, encouraging and building up one another. Here's a verse from Colossians 3:16, which you may be familiar with, where Paul says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom. And you know, the rest of the verse goes on to speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It's talking about our singing as well. But the focus here is on one another. It's teaching one another, admonishing one another in all wisdom as we sing songs to one another. One anothering is just throughout the New Testament, talking about our interactions with one another frequently in assembly. This verse in Hebrews 10, which is often used to shame people for not going to church, well, let's look at what it really says. And here's what it really says. It says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. That's what we should be doing, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. So yeah, the reason that why you want to be meeting together and not neglecting to meet together is because that is the time when we have with one another to stir up one another to be more loving and to do more good things for our people and our family and our community. And what we should be doing when we get together is encouraging one another all the more. Throughout the New Testament, this one anothering aspect is emphasized so much, so frequently, and I think we've almost entirely missed it, largely because we don't have one anothering in a typical church service, in a traditional church meeting. We've got one person doing everything for all of us. After all, we paid him to do it, so we'd better do it, right? So there's another concept about one anothering that Craig Evans mentions in his article back in 1981. He says, since preaching or heralding is almost always monologic It's no wonder that the congregation begins to feel like an audience. Monologue, one-way communication, can be detrimental for edifying and equipping the saints for the work of ministry. So he sees this unique aspect. One anothering is dialogic. It's dialogue of people talking with each other to build one another up. Monologue or sermons or preaching is monologic. It's one way, one guy blasting away and hoping that it hits somebody somewhere in a good fashion. That is our concept versus their concept. So that's biblically what we lack, number one, which is one anothering. Number two, I think we're lacking multiple perspectives when we do things the way we're doing them by having just one person doing all the talking in these big gatherings. Let me explain here. In 1 Corinthians 14, which is again the longest and most detailed passage in the entire Bible that deals specifically with what Christians should be doing in their assemblies, Paul there says, when you come together, again, the context here is exactly what we're talking about. When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. And the rest of that verse is, let all things be done for edification. But it's interesting. He indicates that each one's got something. They may have a hymn, somebody may have a lesson, somebody have any of these other things. And if you go on elsewhere in this chapter, in verses 29 and 31, Paul says, let two or three prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may encourage, all may learn and all be encouraged. Isn't that interesting? Paul wants two or three prophets. He doesn't want one guy getting up and dominating the whole thing. And then everybody else has a role in weighing what is said. And then you can all prophesy one by one. In case you got 5 or 6 prophets who want to speak, you can have all of them do it one by one so that everybody can learn and everybody can be encouraged by what's going on. My point here is it's not just one person. There's 2 or 3 people speaking in this setting. In Romans chapter 12, Paul is going into a discussion about the different gifts that people have in the body of Christ. He says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let's use them. The one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation. Paul again recognizes that there might be people who excel at teaching and might be people who excel at exhortation. These two are two different kinds of communication, and they kind of require 2 different kinds of personalities, 2 different kinds of gifting in order to get these jobs done. But it's interesting that he has there are multiple perspectives going on by these people who are teaching and exhorting. 1 Peter 4 is also another one of these passages that talks about the different kinds of gifts in the body. Peter says, as each person, each one has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies. Everybody's got a gift. And I kind of get the impression here with Peter. He says that that people have perhaps 1 or 2 kinds of gifts. Your gift might be in the speaking realm, whether that's rebuking or exhorting or teaching, whatever those different kinds of communications are, or your gifting may be in the role of serving. All this kind of fits really well with a first century church context of people meeting in homes. Now think about that. They're gathered around in a living room, much like you are here today, but there's almost always going to be food involved. And so there's some hospitality involved, some serving of the guests going on, whether it's the preparation of food or in whatever way of preparing the room and the whole thing for everybody's comfort and safety. So there are people who excel at serving, and then there are those who excel at speaking. But whatever it is you got, make sure you're using it by the strength which God supplies. That's Peter's point here. Let me go back here just to emphasize this thing again. The point is multiple perspectives are being offered in these assemblies. It's not just one person doing all the talking. Several people are contributing to each assembly, whether it's in speaking or in serving. But let's focus on the speaking aspect for just a second. What a difference it would make, I think, if you could hear from more than one person every week. You look around the room where you are right now. Each person has a gift. Each person has perspective on whatever the topic is, no matter what it is the topic you're speaking on. And we need to hear from them. And I think by hearing from all of them together in one group, we then get a better idea of the will of God and the word of God on that topic for us on that day. But it's got to come out of the body of Christ, not just one person dictating what he thinks about what everybody should be thinking or believing or doing. So the third thing we lacked, besides one anothering and besides multiple perspectives, is this: opportunity for development. Now think about this. In Hebrews chapter 5, this very curious verse appears. The writer says, by this time, folks, you guys ought to be teachers, but you need someone to teach you, the basic principles. Solid food is for the mature, but for those who have had their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. So the point here is the writer sees being able to teach as a natural evolutionary process in the growth of most Christians. Now, some people will never have the gift of teaching. I get that. That's okay. Nobody needs to feel less of themselves because of that. But by this time, you ought to be teachers. And the writer here is shaming those folks in this particular congregation who had not reached that level. They're just not gaining anything. They're not learning anything. They're not developing. So how would people be developing in the first century church? I tend to think that if all of us sit in a large sanctuary and listen to one person talk every week, and then we all go home, I don't think, that's my personal opinion, that that's a great way for people to develop and get better. Who's going to actually be developing into becoming teachers by sitting there and listening every week? I actually have been to congregations where I've seen people who have been there for 50 years and they're still not teaching anybody anything. Something's wrong with what we're doing if we cannot be developing people through what we're doing. In 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says to Timothy, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Paul has this process in mind of how we develop a continuing, nonstop generation of new teachers being developed. Now, teachers is his word. Now, we might be using the word preacher today, even though we're using it in an unbiblical sense. This is the way Paul would ensure that every generation of Christians would have somebody capable of leading. You look for faithful people who would be able to teach others as well, and then you train them. And I suggest that a lot of the training takes place in the Christian assembly itself. If you give many people the opportunity to speak, many people the opportunity to express what's on their mind, the questions that they have, the different points of view that they have, that it's through that process that each person develops, gets better, becomes more mature, more spiritual, and more wise. In that setting, if somebody does that for the next 20 years of their life, I think they're going to develop in somebody, yes, who would be able to be a teacher of other people. So a question I have is how in the world are modern churches training and producing a constant supply of pastoral leaders? In most churches I've ever been associated with over the last 50 years as an adult, they're not doing anything to train and produce a constant supply of pastoral leaders. They're sort of counting on God eventually knocking on the door of somebody's heart in the middle of the night in a dream somewhere and calling him to the ministry and then sending him off to a seminary somewhere. And that's how they're going to become a pastoral leader. Why is it a church itself can't be doing that? Don't they know enough? Aren't they good enough? Aren't they smart enough? Aren't they wise enough? And if they're not, why aren't they? What has been going wrong with our churches so that we aren't developing people like this on a regular basis? Yet we have to send them outside the church in order to become a pastoral leader? Now, I understand the whole idea of seminaries. I've spent 9 years of my life in seminary. So I love seminary. I'd love to go back and be there the rest of my life. I just love it. But something's missing when we have to send people out in order for them to get any better. So biblically, what we lack, I think, are these three things and perhaps a whole lot more: one anothering and seeing multiple perspectives and to have opportunity for development. One illustration comes to my mind here. Back in the 70s, when I was first involved in preaching, I said the word preach. You see that? Back when I was, yeah, and that's what they called it. I ran across a book called Disciple, and I believe that book was by Juan Carlos Ortiz. As I recall, he was a well-known speaker for churches in Argentina, I think.
Yes.
And he made some of you, have you heard of him?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
great. Some great stuff there. But what I remember out of his book was he said the pastor becomes a cork, like a cork in a bottle. And everybody inside the bottle can never grow any higher than what that pastor has done, because he's the only person who is allowed to speak, the only person who does the speaking, and thus nobody grows any higher or any more wise than that guy. He's the master. Everybody else is his disciple. But if you have multiple perspectives, if you have one anothering taking place in the assembly, you have enormous opportunity for development so that there's no cork that's preventing them from growing, except the cork of all the people who are doing the teaching and not just one person. I go back to this image that I shared with you last time. I found this image on the internet. I'm not sure who's responsible for it. I'd love to be able to credit him on this, but this is somebody's depiction of what an early church gathering was like. You notice they're in somebody's home. Notice there's no holy garb or no crosses and stained glass windows. There's none of the sanctified elements. It's just folks. And you want to know what the sanctified elements are? It's the people. They are the holy ones. They are the saints that Paul was writing to. They are the hagioi, which is the Greek term. All of them are the holy ones in which the Holy Spirit exists, and you let anybody then speak to share with others, and through that process, we all gain, we all develop. Now, let me end with maybe a little 5-minute segment. It's just sort of a bonus segment on this issue of Christian speaking methods. One of those Christian speaking types is evangelizing. And for all my life, I had heard the idea that all Christians are called to evangelize. And I've often heard this preached in a pulpit. See, there I use the word preach again. But I've heard this hammered away, and that if you're not evangelizing your neighbors, then you're going to go to hell yourself. Yes, I've heard it expressed in such terms. But one time I started to get involved in actually studying this concept in the New Testament. And I came across some interesting things. First of all, this guy's kind of intimidating. Right? Anybody who's an evangelist necessarily has the unpleasant job of really letting people have it. This isn't for everybody. But in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, which is one of the more abused scriptures on this, where Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you." We say this verse applies to everybody. Okay, but let's look at the context. What's really going on in Matthew 28, Jesus is saying these words, not to everybody. He's saying them rather specifically to the 12 disciples. And again, these are 12 disciples that he personally handpicked not just random, just grabbing 12 people anywhere, handpicked. And then he had them walk with him wherever he went for 3 years, listening to every word he said. And they had opportunities to ask questions and get answers and be rebuked in that whole process. Through that training process, and now that Jesus has been raised from the dead, he now can say to these people, now, therefore, you guys go and make disciples of all nations. Because this job of being an evangelist is a tough one, and not everybody's cut out for this. It's a rather unique set of skills that's required to be an evangelist. Jesus, I think, knew that. That's why he handpicked these people. That's why he trained them the way he did, and that's why he commissioned them. There's a few other scriptures that are worth looking at here on this issue, like Ephesians 4, which says, he gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. Or the way some preachers would have it, he's gave all people to be evangelists. Well, no, wait a minute. It's not what it says. Paul says here, some have this role. Some have the job of being an apostle or a pastor and a teacher. I think it's the next verse I have here on the screen, 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul says there, God has arranged the parts of the body just as he desired. If they were all one part, where would the body be? All are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they? So Paul teaches, as Peter does as well, and I think Jesus essentially is getting this point across as well, that different people have different giftings, and we need to lay off the idea that everybody needs to be evangelizing or else they're going to go to hell. There are some helpful verses on this, and one verse that presents a real balanced view on this is at the end of Colossians, where Paul has been writing to the Christians at Colossae, and he says, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word. Who does he mean by us? Well, he's talking about Paul and his evangelistic associates. He wants the congregation there, the regular Christians at the church, to pray for the evangelists that God may open to them a door for the word. And then he says to them, but you guys conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Your speech must always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to respond to each one. Now, here we have a rare verse in the New Testament that actually talks about what our responsibility is to outsiders, and we're to conduct ourselves wisely toward outsiders. Make the most of the time. Yes, we want to try to be working toward their bringing them into the fold of the body of Christ, but we do so by our speech being gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you will know how to respond to each one. It's interesting he uses the word respond as if our position is more of a defensive role and not an offensive role where we're preaching at them. No, we're actually responding to the questions they have once they've realized that our lives are different and are changed. I think that's helpful as we consider our role in the church. So let's summarize our biblical evidence. Teaching and exhorting are the most common types of assembly speaking in the New Testament, and the common purpose for assembly speaking throughout the New Testament is clearly edifying one another and strengthening one another. There are always opportunities for several people to participate in the speaking functions in these early gatherings. I just wonder, are our gatherings the same? What are we lacking? What are we missing by not doing things the way they did them in the first century church? To recap overall what we did last time when we talked about in the first century, they did not describe their meetings as worship, nor did they describe their meetings as a service. They saw their meetings rather as horizontally focused gatherings and not as formal ceremonial events. Preaching, as we discussed today, is not an assembly activity, ironically. Encouraging and teaching, however, are. And that's my message here about why they didn't preach sermons in the early church.